The Korean War ran from June 25th of 1950 until July 27th of 1953. During that time, almost 104,000 Americans were wounded and almost 37,000 Americans were killed. I'm Thomas Carroll. Join me while we take a look back at the forgotten faces from a forgotten war.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Forgotten Faces podcast. Today, we are going to talk about Medal of Honor winner Hector Cafferata. I came across Hector Cafferata's story many years ago when I had received a book called The Last Stand of Fox Company. It was written by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin. And that book just completely enthralled me. It got me interested in the Korean War and just the heroism and the stories. You just have to look at it and remember that these really happened. Was not Hollywood. This stuff really happened. So Private Cafferata's story is fairly well documented in the book, including using a shovel to hit hand grenades back like baseballs. But Private Cafferata was born November 4th, 1929 in New York City. His father was a Peruvian migrant and his mother was a New Jersey native. Now, he grew up in the Lake Hiawatha section of Parsippany, New Jersey. He went to high school at Boonton, where in his sophomore year, he started playing football. And after his high school graduation, he continued to play semi-pro football. And it was during his time playing football where he met, which would become his foxhole buddy. It would be his best friend is Kenneth Benson. Now, on February the 15th of 1948, Hector had enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve, and he was assigned to the 21st Infantry Reserve Battalion. It was based at Dover, New Jersey. On September 6th of 1950, he was called to active duty, where he was sent to Camp Pendleton, California, for additional training and preparation for being sent overseas. Now, by October of 1950, he was shipped out to Korea, where he joined Fox Company's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, the 1st Marine Division. Now, the 1st Marine Division had already been in Korea. They had taken part in the Incheon landings, where they had pushed north and were able to recapture the South Korean capital city of Seoul. After Seoul was liberated, the 1st Marine Division, they were loaded back on the ships, where they actually sailed around Korea to the eastern side, where they took part in the Wonsan landings on October 26th. Now, if you listened to any of our the previous 2 episodes with Christopher Russell, where we were talking about Philip Thomas Hughes, where he was killed in action around Wonsan. This story kind of basically picks up right where that timeline left off. Now, the 1st Marine Division was tasked with pushing north to the Yalu River as fast as possible. Now, General O.P. Smith did not agree with his superiors on the order, and he had become convinced that they were stretched horribly thin and that the Chinese forces had already entered the war, which the Chinese had entered the war, hundreds of thousands of them. So General Smith had purposely slowed his advance and consolidated his troops along the way at every opportunity that he could find. But on November 27th, in the area of the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, the Ninth People's Volunteer Army, quote unquote, volunteer army of the Chinese, had surprised and attacked the 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir. It was a brutal 17-day battle that had taken place in extremely cold conditions. I mean, we're talking 25-ish below zero, snow, extremely rugged terrain, just, steep mountains, deep ravines. And the main focus of this battle was the 78-mile-long road that served as the 1st Marines' only route of escape from the Chosin Reservoir. And to call it a road, it's a bit of a stretch. It was more or less a dirt path, if you will, just big enough for trucks in most places. Now, Fox Company was tasked with helping keep the road open at a place called Tuk Tong Pass, and it would later be called by some as the Battle of Fox Hill. But Hector and his 218 other Marines were tasked with keeping the road open, and they were busy trying to scrape out foxholes. This was their first night there. They were busy trying to scrape out the foxholes in the frozen earth. Now, Hector and his best friend, Kenneth Benson, from back in New Jersey, were on the northwest corner of the hill out on the left flank, and they were actually out ahead outside of the perimeter to act as listening post. What a listening post really was supposed to do, sit out in front of the lines when they would see the enemy coming, kind of try to get a count of how many were coming at them, and then scurry back to the main perimeter to prepare. But in the snow, the cold and the snow, the Chinese wore white, heavy quilted jacket, white, heavy quilted pants to stay warm. They blended in very well. Now at 2:07 roughly a.m. on November the 29th, the first group of Chinese had marched right down the main road and right into the machine guns of the Fox Company, who was guarding the road down the hill from where Hector was. That was where the first openings of the battle had started. Shortly after, a group of 500 or so Chinese had came across the small, saddle across the ravine in front of Hector's position. They had no time to evacuate. They were out there alone. The Chinese had thrown a small satchel charge that had landed right in their foxhole. Kenneth Benson had grabbed it. He tossed it away before it could explode. And Hector, who was an excellent shot with his rifle, began shooting and almost immediately had killed a dozen Chinese with his rifle. But the Chinese just overwhelmed them, being 500 or so. And Kenneth and Hector found themselves surrounded. Now, cut off from the rest of Fox Company, there were two enemy riflemen that had breached Hector's foxhole. Hector used his entrenching tool to basically beat them off. And the two men continued to fight. They were eventually able to fight their way back towards the main perimeter for Fox Company, where they basically fell into another foxhole that held two other Marines. This is where they stood and turned to fight out for the next several hours to the Chinese. Now, after a brief lull in the action, a second wave of the Chinese, they'd regrouped and they made a second attack, basically following the same path. It was during this attack that Hector had caught multiple grenades out of the air, barehanded, just caught them, threw them away before they could explode. At one point in time, was even standing on the edge of the foxhole with his entrenching tool, which is just a short shovel, which 3-ish feet long, and was hitting the grenades back as just as fast as he could. And Hector would like always joke that he was the world's worst baseball player. And finally a grenade that had landed in the foxhole right in front of Hector. Hector picked it up and he went to throw it back. And as he threw it, it exploded and it wounded his left hand. Pretty hateful, but he was able to continue on firing with his M1 Garand rifle. Second grenade that landed right in front of Kenneth Benson. Kenneth wasn't able to get to it. It exploded, and the shrapnel had peppered his face and rendered him temporarily blind. Fortunately for Kenneth, later on, he was able to regain his eyesight, but at the time being, he was left blind. So being unable to fire, Kenneth, though, being as well-trained as Marines were, he was perfectly capable of loading M1 Garand rifles blind. So he would load an empty rifle. He would give it to Hector, who would fire until it was empty. And then Kenneth would take the empty and reload it. And they spent hours like that fighting on, where Hector was witness to killed possibly about 40 soldiers that night. Now, by 8 a.m., Hector, who at the beginning of the battle wasn't even wearing boots, he had his feet tucked into a sleeping bag to try to keep him warm because it was so brutally cold. He had gone on for about 6 hours now without boots or anything on. He was just in his socks in 25 below zero in the snow. After the Chinese had kind of tapered off, which the Chinese were prone to attack more at night than during the daytime, Hector was trying to make his way back to their original foxhole to hopefully pick up his gear, including his boots and whatever else was left. He got to the foxhole, he got in, he bent down to pick his stuff up, and when he stood up, a sniper on the hill above him fired a round that hit him in the right shoulder. The bullet kind of angled down. It hit one of his ribs. It ricocheted off a rib and punctured one of his lungs. Now, Hector spent the next little while in his foxhole, pinned down by sniper's fire and by, I'm sure, the extreme pain of that kind of wounding. He was eventually able to make his way to the med tent that was down the hill. Now, hours afterwards, he's still suffering from his bullet wound and severe frostbite on his feet. He was finally given a pair of boots that were taken from a dead medical corpsman that had been killed. The boots were not the right size, so the toes of them were cut off and his toes stuck out. Now, Hector spent the rest of the battle, it was about an 8-day battle, you could almost call it a siege, if you will, in the med tent, obviously. And then finally, by the 2nd of December, Fox Company, with their 6th day on the hill, finally was coming to an end of the battle. The main group of the 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir was able to successfully break out and make their way south with all their equipment. During this time, a a group of men led by Lieutenant Colonel Ray Davis, they called themselves the Ridge Runners, actually took a more overland route over the mountains and the ravines to try to bring some relief to the various marine companies that were fighting and trying to hold the road open, which included Fox Company, Charlie Company, Howe Company, and that's all I believe I can think of off the top of my head. But they were finally able to bring relief to Fox Company, who, though severely undermanned, had held tight. And then finally, by the 4th of December, most of the 1st Marine Division had reached the headquarter areas at Hagururi. I hope I pronounced that right. I'm not superb at pronouncing Asian names. From there, the 1st Marine Division consolidated, and they eventually moved all the way south and were evacuated at the port of Hungnam. Now, most of the more seriously wounded, including Hector Cafferata, were air evac'd from there. Now, Hector would spend the next 18 months undergoing surgeries and rehabilitations at various hospitals in Japan and the United States, including the bullet wound had actually caused some pretty bad nerve damage in his arm that left him with slightly diminished ability, but he was able to relearn how to write, how to shoot a rifle and everything. Now, and then Fox Company's Lieutenant Bob McCarthy was the one who put Hector Cafferata in for the Medal of Honor. Now, McCarthy had figured overall that he had killed about 100 of the enemy, but he wrote it up as a much lower number, figuring that saying that he killed 100 was somewhat unbelievable. And on November 24th, 1952, Hector officially received the Medal of Honor from President Truman. Now, Hector Cafferata was a giant of a person, over 6 feet tall. A lot of his friends, I believe, called him Big Heck. But President Truman actually had to stand on his shoes to put the medal over his head. Now, Hector Cafferata's Medal of Honor commendation reads as follows: Private Hector A. Cafferata, Jr., United States Marine Corps Reserve, Company F, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, Korea, 28 November 1950. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a rifleman with Company F, in action against enemy aggressor forces when all the other members of his rifle team became casualties, creating a gap in the line. During the initial phase of a vicious attack launched by a fanatical enemy of regimental strength against his company's hill position, Private Cafferata waged a lone battle with grenades and rifle fire as the attack gained momentum and the enemy threatened penetration through the gap and endangered the integrity of the entire defensive perimeter. Making a target of himself under the devastating fire from automatic weapons, rifles, grenades, and mortars, he maneuvered up and down the line and delivered accurate and effective fire against the onrushing force, killing 15, wounding many more, and forcing the others to withdraw so that reinforcements could move up and consolidate the position. Again, fighting desperately against a renewed onslaught later that same morning, when a hostile grenade landed in a shallow entrenchment occupied by wounded Marines, Private Cafferata rushed into the gully under heavy fire seized a deadly missile in his right hand, and hurled it free of his comrades before it detonated, severing part of one finger, seriously wounding him in the right hand and arm. Courageously ignoring the intense pain, he staunchly fought on until he was struck by a sniper's bullet and forced to submit to evacuation for medical treatment. Cafferata, by his fortitude, great personal valor, and dauntless perseverance in face of almost certain death, saved the lives of his fellow Marines and contributed essentially to the success of his company in maintaining its defensive position against tremendous odds. His extraordinary heroism throughout was in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Naval Service. Now, later on, after the war, Hector Cafferata had sold hunting and fishing equipment, worked for the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife, and ran a tavern. He sparingly spoke of his experiences, and it was quoted as saying, "I did my duty. I protected my fellow Marines. They protected me, and I am prouder of that than the fact that the government gave me a Medal of Honor." Now, he recommended and lobbied for his friend Kenneth Benson to receive the Medal of Honor, who did not, but Kenneth Benson was issued a Silver Star for his actions. Private Cafferata passed away on April 12th, 2016 in hospice care in Venice, Florida. I had actually even was able to track down Hector Cafferata's daughter. She declined to interview and said that her father, she also said her father rarely spoke about it unless he was with select friends. So she declined the interview, but she did say that the most important thing that she wanted everybody to know about Hector Cafferata is that he was a wonderful father and a very humble man. So I regret, I would have loved greatly to talk to her, but I respect her decision not to. I would like to thank everybody for listening to the Forgotten Faces podcast. I remember you can check our show notes at forgottenfacespodcast.wordpress.com. You can find us on all of the major podcast platforms. You can now find us on YouTube. You can search for Forgotten Faces Podcast on Facebook and follow the page there. And if anybody knows a Korean War veteran, knows the family of a Korean War veteran, you can send an email to forgottenfacespodcast@gmail.com. I would love to talk to them. Thank you again for listening to the Forgotten Faces podcast.